Hi, thanks everyone for joining us. It's a real pleasure to be in Basel for the first time, actually, in Art Basel, to be presenting the work of my aunt, Pacita Abad. It's been an interesting few years in terms of the rediscovery of her practice. I'm an artist myself, but I've been involved in curating her work and in framing the discussion surrounding her practice and why it's relevant now through these kind of interesting times we're living in. Europe in particular has been a really crucial place in presenting the work of Pacita and in showing her work in institutions. So Pacita's work was part of the Berlin Biennial in 2020, and then there was a solo presentation of her work at Spike Island in Bristol in 2020 as well. 2020 has been an interesting year for many reasons. And currently there is a selection of her trapunto paintings on show at Haus der Kunst in Munich as part of a group exhibition called Sweat. So it's great to be able to then show the work here at Art Basel in a way as a way of supporting all these institutional presentations. I'm sure many of you who are joining us this morning are already familiar with Pacita Abad's practice, but I thought I'd start with a brief introduction. Pacita Abad was a Filipino-American artist who, had a global practice. So she was born in Batanes in the Philippines, a very small island, but then ended up living and practicing in over 50 countries and traveling in maybe 100 more. So really the practice is global, and it makes sense that as we begin to rediscover her work, that we engage with a global and international audience. Just before this fair, we were just at, I was just at Dubai at the Jameel Art Center, where Pacita was the focus of the first museum presentation ever for a Filipino artist in the Gulf. So these international, these transnational conversations are very much a part of really framing her practice and understanding her work. For Art Basel, the work shifts a little bit. So the past few presentations have been really focused on her trapunto paintings, which are these quilted, heavily embellished paintings that depict masks, underwater series, social realist tableaus. But this is really going to be the first presentation of her abstract paintings in an art fair, and it's good to do it here at Art Basel. The series that Silverlens is presenting at Art Basel is from her Endless Blues series, which was the final series that she worked on up until her death in 2004. And over a period of 4 years, I think she started this in 2001, she worked endlessly in creating this incredible body of maybe 40 paintings. And they're not trapuntos, they're canvas collages. And the story of how this came about really is a really good way of discussing how she saw abstraction in her work. For Pacita, abstraction wasn't the absence of representation. In fact, the way she talked about abstraction, it was always very much a part of her, political point of view. Sometimes when events are so overwhelming, both political and personal, that representation can't quite encompass it. It's when abstraction really becomes a place where she's able to process her emotions, she's able to process, what she's seeing, and at the same time, she's able to incorporate these different materials from different parts of the world that have become really foundational in how she saw her practice. So the series is called Endless Blues because it was a product of many different upheavals for her, both political and personal. I remember reading her short writings while she was working on it. She mentions two political events that were pivotal in starting the series. The first one was the 9/11 attacks in New York City. And the second one was the subsequent, I guess, invasion or the war in Afghanistan that was led by the US after 9/11. And for her, she said these two cities, these two places, New York and Afghanistan, really were both very important in her formations as an artist. I think a huge part of Pacita's mythology was she was actually not meant to be an artist. But there was this epic trip that she did in the late 70s before she decided that she wanted to paint, where she traveled by land from Turkey all the way to Southeast Asia, spending a considerable amount of time in Afghanistan. And there, she encountered, all these rich traditions, all the different communities that you may not necessarily encounter in any other place. And so she always spoke of Afghanistan as a place really dear to her as an artist. And on the other hand, there's New York City, where she lived for a short period of time and actually enrolled at the Artist Student League of New York, which, art historically speaking, was a really important place for Asian American artists and other immigrant artists of that time to take lessons and actually meet other artists of color. So New York and Afghanistan were key in developing this body of work. And I think that says a lot as well about how, for Pacita, each painting isn't just a painting, but it's also a map of so many different things. It's a map of her emotions. It's a map of, the incredible way that she deals with color. And it's a map of places that you may not immediately think as occupying the same surface. But she finds a way to have, to bring together these different contexts, and at the same time explode them into this kind of exuberant, monumental compositions of color, pattern, and texture. So Endless Blues was a product of her dealing with these kind of international political tragedies, but it was also a product of a very personal upheaval. So Pacita started the series when she was diagnosed with cancer, which would eventually claim her life, sadly, in 2004. And confined to her studio, she really produced work, and she endlessly worked. I mean, she was always incredibly productive, producing over, 5,000 works in a 32-year career. But this was the last burst of incredible productivity, and it came at a time when she couldn't travel. She was confined to her studio, and this series was a product of that. It was a testament to her work ethic, but it's also a celebration of how she carried on working, and a celebration to her commitment to making work and bringing places, communities, and different materials together. So one of the 3 paintings in this series, and actually it's one of my favorite titles of her work. I mean, she was so good at titling her pieces. But this piece is called Blues Train to Jogja, which is obviously a pun on that famous blues song, Blues Train to Georgia. And I think it probably shows materially and polyphonically, the two different cultural traditions or artifacts that kind of inform this series. So as you can see, there's a lot of batik, Indonesian batik textiles in the work. And then there's that reference to blues music. So in this series, Pacita brings 2 things that you might not necessarily think of as one and the same thing, but so batik and blues. And I think this is her way of, again, bringing different traditions together, different material together, to create something totally original and totally celebratory of both as well. And blues, I think in particular, was an amazing accompaniment to her when she was working in the studio in early 2000s, because it brought her back to her time in San Francisco in the late 60s and 70s, where she was beginning to find her voice as an artist. And she used to go to a lot of blues and jazz bars. And so having this music in her studio at a time when she couldn't go anywhere was in a way transporting. But I think the amazing thing about her work is it's transporting, but also transformative. That there's always this incredible, it takes you on journeys, even when she couldn't go anywhere. There was always this insistence on taking you to places and making you see things in different ways. And I think one of the most important ways that she both transformed the viewer's experience and transported them was through color. And she was incredibly adept at using color. And in a way, this series was also part of a chapter in her life when she'd left the US and then moved back to Southeast Asia, first to Jakarta in the late 90s and then to Singapore. And for her, she said that actually leaving the US and going back to Southeast Asia was a really important way to regain her sense of color. I think the East Coast winters, as she felt, were affecting that. And so these works were became a celebration of, in a way, of that reclaiming of color, but it just shows how formally she was just so good at it. Like looking at this painting, which is called Paris in the Fall, you kind of read it as a yellow painting, but looking closer, it's actually like mint green. And the idea of like starting a painting with mint green it seems quite, I don't know, it's not a color that you use a base, but she uses it to then lead you to experience other types of colors in the painting in different ways. And that transformation and that celebration is in every single surface and in every single stitch surface of these works. One thing that we're not able to show here, but actually it's something that when we present these paintings in different contexts, is you get to see the back of these paintings, and they're incredibly stitched and incredibly, you get the sense of structure, but also the sense of them being so carefully cultivated by her hand. And that sense of care that comes from her, not just in terms of making, but also in making sure that, by working with her hands and carefully constructing these paintings, that she's really able to, in a way, pay tribute to all of these cultural elements that have influenced and shaped her life. And so as much as the Endless Blues series, come from such a serious place of upheaval, they also become these incredible, in a way, facets of how she celebrated life and she celebrated art amidst, the difficulty of actually, of the situation she was in. So to transform grief and loss into these compositions of such exuberance and such, vibrancy is really something that Pacita Abad does best.